Honorable members of the United Nations General Assembly, on behalf of the African Union, I extend my greetings to this esteemed assembly. May this session be remembered as one of the most historic gatherings in global history. As President of the African Union, representing the General Assembly's 64th session, the African Union, and over 1,000 traditional African kingdoms, I take this opportunity to congratulate our son, Barack Obama, who is attending this assembly. We welcome him as the leader of the host nation for this gathering. This session convenes at a time when the world is facing unprecedented challenges. Now, more than ever, the global community must unite to confront our shared adversaries: climate change, economic crises, food and water scarcity, desertification, terrorism, forced migration, piracy, epidemics both natural and man-made, nuclear proliferation, and moral decline. Some, like the H1N1 virus, may have even originated as military experiments that spiraled out of control. The United Nations was founded by a handful of nations in the aftermath of World War II, a body shaped by the victors, designed against Germany. These nations established the Security Council, granted themselves permanent membership, and claimed the veto power. But where were we? The majority of today's nations were absent when this system was created. The United Nations was built by a few, for a few, at the expense of many. If we examine the UN Charter, we find a glaring contradiction. The preamble declares that all nations, big or small, are equal, yet the very structure of the Security Council denies this principle. Do we have a permanent seat? Do we have veto power? Are we truly equal? No, we are not. The preamble speaks of justice, equality, and the rights of all nations, yet the articles that follow grant unchecked power to a select few. This contradiction cannot be ignored. The African Union, alongside the voices of the silenced nations, rejects and refuses to recognize the veto power and the permanent seats. The time has come for true reform of United Nations that represents all, not just a privileged few. Asterisk in the preamble of the United Nations Charter, it is clearly stated that the use of armed force is permitted only when it serves the common interests of all nations. This was the understanding we agreed to when joining the United Nations. However, what have we witnessed since then? Over 65 wars have erupted since the creation of the United Nations and the Security Council. These wars, which have resulted in millions of victims, many more than the Second World War, have not been fought in the interests of all nations as the Charter intended. Instead, they were driven by the interests of a select few countries. This starkly contradicts the principles laid out in the Charter that we signed. If we are to remain true to the Charter, we must reject this approach and speak frankly, without diplomatic pretense. The preamble also affirms that, should armed force be used, it must be authorized by the United Nations collectively. It should not be the decision of one or two countries, but rather a collective action agreed upon by all. When an act of aggression occurs, such as one country attacking another, the entire United Nations is responsible for responding, as we all share the responsibility to protect the sovereignty of every nation. Yet, since the formation of the United Nations in 1945, 65 aggressive wars have taken place without any intervention from the United Nations. Moreover, 8 other major wars, with a death toll of about 2 million, were initiated by countries with veto power in the Security Council. These countries, claiming to act in the name of peace and security, have instead used aggressive force, revealing the hypocrisy of the current system. The Charter of the United Nations enshrines the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of states. No country has the right to meddle in the internal matters of another, whether the government is democratic or not. This is the responsibility of each country's people, as was demonstrated in ancient Rome, where leaders were chosen based on what was best for the society at the time. We joined the United Nations believing that all nations were equal, but now we see that a few countries have granted themselves permanent seats and veto powers in the Security Council, while the rest of us are left without a voice. The only country elected to permanent status through the democratic process is China. The others impose their positions through undemocratic means, and we must not accept that. The call for Security Council reform should not focus on simply increasing the number of permanent members, which would only make the situation worse. Adding more large countries would only perpetuate the imbalance of power and create further division. This would intensify competition for seats, particularly between countries like Italy, Germany, Indonesia, India, Japan, Brazil, and many others. The solution is not to expand the council, but to close the door to new members, as this would increase poverty, injustice, and global tension. The answer lies in a binding resolution adopted by the General Assembly, which should be led by the will of the majority and without the influence of any other body. The Security Council must not expand any further, and instead, the powers and responsibilities of the Council should be transferred to the General Assembly. Membership should be based on unions, not individual states, to ensure equality among all nations. This approach would allow every country to have an equal opportunity to be represented. The spirit of the preamble demands that no nation be denied a seat, and a fair process should ensure that even countries like Italy or Argentina have their rightful place. The door to new permanent seats in the Security Council must be closed once and for all. This approach is a deception, a trick that has already been exposed. If we want to reform the United Nations, bringing in more superpowers is not the solution. The right course is to promote democracy at the level of the General Assembly, where the powers of the Security Council should be transferred. The Security Council should become simply an instrument to implement the decisions made by the General Assembly, which would act as the world's legislative body. This assembly is our democratic platform, and the Security Council should answer to it. We cannot accept the current system. These are the lawmakers of the United Nations, and their resolutions should hold binding power. It's often said that the General Assembly should do whatever the Security Council recommends. On the contrary, the Security Council should act according to the General Assembly's decisions. This is the United Nations, made up of 192 countries, not just the Security Council, which consists of only 15 member states. How can we claim to ensure global peace and security if 5 countries hold all the control? We, 192 nations, are like a speaker's corner in London's Hyde Park, merely talking without having any impact. We're nothing but decoration without true influence. We make speeches and then fade away. This is our current reality. Once the Security Council becomes only an executive body for implementing General Assembly resolutions, there will be no competition for its membership. With this change, there will be no need for any competition. The Security Council should truly represent all nations. Under the proposed changes, permanent seats on the Security Council would go to all unions and regional groups of countries. The 27 countries of the European Union should hold a permanent seat. The African Union's member states should also have 1. The countries of Latin America and ASEAN should each have a permanent seat. The Russian Federation and the United States are already permanent members. The Southern African Development Community (SADC), once fully established, should also have a permanent seat. The 22 nations of the Arab League should be granted one, as should the 57 countries of the Islamic Conference. The 118 member states of the non-aligned movement should be represented too. There is also the G100. Perhaps the smaller countries could have a permanent seat as well. Those nations not part of the unions I've mentioned could take turns holding a seat, rotating every 6 or 12 months. Countries like Japan and Australia, which are not members of groups like ASEAN or the Russian Federation, could be part of this system. This could be a solution if the General Assembly votes in favor of it. The issue at hand is extremely important. As previously mentioned, the General Assembly is the Congress and Parliament of the world. The global leader, we, the nations, are the true representatives, and anyone outside of this General Assembly should not be acknowledged. The President of the Assembly, Mr. Ali Abdulsalam Treki, and the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon will prepare the legal draft and establish the necessary committees to submit this proposal for a vote. From now on, the Security Council will consist of unions of nations. This approach will bring about justice and democracy. No longer will the Security Council be made up of countries selected because of their nuclear weapons, large economies, or advanced technology. That is pure terrorism. We cannot allow superpowers to control the Security Council. That in itself is a form of terrorism. If we want a world that is united, safe, and peaceful, this is the path we should take. If we choose to remain in a world at war, that is a decision for you to make. We will continue to face conflict and violence until the end of the world. All Security Council members should have the right to exercise the veto. If that's not possible, we should eliminate the entire concept of the veto with this new formation of the Council. This would make it a true Security Council. According to the new proposals presented to the General Assembly, it will become an executive council under the control of the General Assembly. which will have the actual power and authority to make all decisions. This will ensure that all countries are on an equal footing within the Security Council, just as they are in the General Assembly. In the General Assembly, every member has equal rights in terms of membership and voting. The same should apply in the Security Council. Currently, some countries have a veto, while others do not. Some countries hold permanent seats and others do not. We should not accept this imbalance, nor should we accept any resolution passed by the Security Council in its current form. We were once under trusteeship, colonized, and now we are independent. We are here today to determine the future of the world in a democratic manner that will preserve the peace and security of all nations, regardless of size, on an equal basis. Otherwise, we face terrorism, not just from groups like Al-Qaeda, but from other forms as well. The majority vote in the General Assembly should guide us. If the General Assembly votes to make a decision, its will should be followed, and its resolutions should be enforced. No one is above the General Assembly. Anyone who claims to be above the Assembly should leave the United Nations and stand alone. Democracy is not for the rich, the most powerful, or for those who practice terrorism. All nations should be treated equally and seen as equals. At present, the Security Council is a form of feudalism. Political feudalism for those with permanent seats, used against the rest of us. It should not be called the Security Council. It should be called the Terror Council. In our political lives, when they need to use the Security Council against us, they do. When it's not in their interest to do so, they ignore the Security Council. When they have an agenda to push, they respect and glorify the United Nations Charter. They refer to Chapter 7 of the Charter and use it against the poor nations. However, when they want to disregard the Charter, they simply ignore it as though it doesn't exist. If the veto power of the permanent members of the Security Council is used to protect those with power, that is an injustice and a form of terrorism. That should not be tolerated. We should not continue to live in the shadow of such injustice and terror. Superpowers have complicated global interests, and they use the veto to safeguard those interests. For instance, in the Security Council, they exploit the power of the United Nations to protect their own interests and to terrorize and intimidate the Third World, keeping it under a constant state of fear since its establishment in 1945. The Security Council has failed to provide true security. Instead, it has provided terror and sanctions. This would be a solution for them if the General Assembly votes in favor of it. The issue is extremely important. As has already been stated, the General Assembly is the world's Congress. A Parliament, the leader of the world. We are the nations, and anyone outside this General Assembly will not be recognized. The President of the Assembly, Mr. Ali Abdulsalam Treki, and Secretary General Ban Ki-moon will prepare the legal draft and set up the necessary committees to submit this proposal for a vote. From now on, the Security Council will consist of unions of nations. This way, we will achieve justice and democracy, and we will no longer have a Security Council made up of countries chosen because of their nuclear weapons, large economies, or advanced technology. That is terrorism. We cannot allow the Security Council to be controlled by superpowers. That in itself is terrorism. If we want a world that is united, safe, and peaceful, this is the way forward. If we want to remain in a world at war, that is up to you. We will continue to fight until doomsday or the end of the world. All Security Council members should have the right to exercise the veto, or we should eliminate the entire concept of the veto with this new formation of the Council. This would create a real Security Council, according to the new proposals. It will be an executive council under the control of the General Assembly, which will have the true power and make all the rules. In this way, all countries will be on equal footing in the Security Council, just as they are in the General Assembly. In the General Assembly, we are all treated equally when it comes to membership and voting. It should be the same in the Security Council. Currently, one country has a veto, another does not. One country has a permanent seat, another does not. We should not accept this, nor should we accept any resolution adopted by the Security Council in its current form. We were once under trusteeship, we were colonized, and now we are independent. We are here today to decide the future of the world in a democratic way that will maintain the peace and security of all nations, large and small, as equals. Otherwise, it is terrorism, for terrorism is not only Al-Qaeda, it can take other forms. We should be guided by the majority votes in the General Assembly alone. If the General Assembly makes a decision through voting, then its wishes should be followed and its decisions enforced. No one is above the General Assembly. Anyone who claims to be above the Assembly should leave the United Nations and stand alone. Democracy is not for the rich or the most powerful or for those who practice terrorism. All nations should be seen as on equal footing. Right now, the Security Council is security feudalism. Political feudalism for those with permanent seats protected by them and used against us. It should be called not the Security Council, but the Terror Council in our political life. If they need to use the Security Council against us, they turn to it. If they have no need to use it against us, they ignore it. If they have an interest to promote and actions to take, they respect and glorify the Charter of the United Nations. They turn to Chapter 7 of the Charter and use it against poor nations. However, if they wish to violate the Charter, they simply ignore it as if it doesn't exist. If the veto of the permanent members of the Security Council is given to those who have the power, this is injustice and terrorism and should not be tolerated by us. We should not live in the shadow of this injustice and terror. Superpowers have complicated global interests and they use the veto to protect those interests. For example, in the Security Council, they use the power of the United Nations to protect their interests and to terrorize and intimidate the Third World, keeping it under the shadow of terror. Since it was created in 1945, the Security Council has failed to provide security. On the contrary, it has provided terror and sanctions. It is only used against us. Because of this, we will no longer be committed to implementing Security Council resolutions. After this speech, which marks the 40th anniversary, 65 wars have broken out, either due to fighting among small countries or wars of aggression waged against us by superpowers.